She moved quietly between the tables, carrying plates with steady hands and a calm face. The restaurant was always busy in the evenings, filled with soft lights, gentle music, and the low hum of conversations. People came dressed in their best clothes, laughing, celebrating, and enjoying their time. In the middle of all this, she remained almost invisible, just another waitress doing her job. Most customers didn't notice her beyond placing their orders. Some barely looked up when she served their food. She didn't mind. She had grown used to being overlooked. In fact, there was something safe about it. No questions, no expectations, no pressure. Just work and then home. Her day usually started early. She lived in a small rented room not far from the restaurant. The place was simple, with only the things she needed. A bed, a small table, a chair near the window, and a worn-out shelf with a few books. There was also an old keyboard in the corner, covered with a cloth. It hadn't been touched in a long time, but she never had the heart to throw it away. Every morning, she would wake up, get ready, and head out before the streets became too crowded. She preferred the quiet hours. It gave her time to think, or sometimes not think at all. By the time she reached the restaurant, the city would already be waking up, and her long shift would begin. The restaurant itself was known for its elegance. Everything inside had been carefully chosen to create a perfect atmosphere. The lights were warm, the furniture polished, and the walls decorated with soft paintings. But the most noticeable thing in the room was the grand piano placed near the center. It wasn't just decoration. On special nights, a professional pianist would come and play, filling the room with beautiful music. On regular days, it stood quietly, almost like it was waiting. Many people admired it, some even took pictures beside it, but very few ever touched it. She always noticed it. Whenever she passed by, even while carrying heavy trays, her eyes would shift toward the piano for just a moment. It wasn't obvious. No one really paid attention. But if someone had watched closely, they would have seen something different in her expression during those brief seconds. Something soft, something distant. It was like she remembered something every time she looked at it. But those moments never lasted long. A call from the kitchen, a customer asking for something, or the manager giving instructions would quickly bring her back to reality. She would continue her work, just like always. The other staff members knew her as someone quiet but reliable. She never complained, never argued, and never caused trouble. If someone needed help, she would step in without hesitation. But she rarely joined conversations or shared anything about her life. At times, they would try to include her. "Why are you always so quiet?" one of them once asked with a smile. She simply shrugged and said, "I'm just tired, I guess." They laughed it off, thinking it was nothing serious. Everyone gets tired. Everyone has their own problems. There was no reason to look deeper, and she preferred it that way. There were moments, though, when the restaurant became calm, especially in the late afternoon before the evening rush. During those quiet hours, she would find herself standing near the piano while cleaning nearby tables. Her movements would slow down, and her thoughts would drift. Once, when no one was around, she gently lifted her hand as if she was about to touch the keys. But before her fingers could reach them, she pulled back quickly, almost as if she had done something wrong. She looked around to make sure no one had seen her. No one had. Still, her heart was beating faster than usual. She took a deep breath and went back to work, trying to ignore the strange feeling inside her. That feeling had been with her for years. There was a time when things were different. A time when music was not something distant or hidden. It had once been a big part of her life. Back then, she didn't just look at pianos. She played them. But life doesn't always move in the direction we expect. Things had changed slowly at first, then all at once. Responsibilities came one after another. Family needed support. Money became more important than dreams. Opportunities slipped away, and with time, the distance between her and music grew wider. At some point, she stopped trying. It wasn't a sudden decision. It just happened. Days turned into months and months into years. The keyboard in her room became silent, just like that part of her life. Still, something never completely disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and there was no one around, she would sit by the window and think about those days. She would remember how it felt to press the keys, how each note carried emotion, how music could say things that words never could. Then she would shake her head, as if trying to push those memories away. "That's in the past," she would whisper to herself. And yet, every time she saw the piano at the restaurant, it felt like the past was standing right in front of her. One evening, while serving a table near the piano, a young child walked up to it. The child's parents were busy talking, not paying much attention. With curiosity in their eyes, the child reached out and pressed a few random keys. The sound was uneven and unplanned, but it echoed through the quiet space. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. She turned her head instantly, her attention fully drawn to the sound. Her expression changed in a way that was hard to describe. It wasn't just surprise. It was something deeper, something more personal. The child laughed and pressed a few more keys, enjoying the noise. A staff member quickly walked over and gently guided the child away, explaining that the piano wasn't to be touched. The moment passed, but for her it stayed. She stood there for a second longer than necessary, holding an empty tray in her hands. Then she slowly turned away and continued working, just like nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted. That night, when she returned to her room, she didn't go straight to bed like she usually did. Instead, she walked over to the corner where the old keyboard was kept. She stood there, staring at it. It looked smaller than she remembered. Dust had gathered on its surface, and the keys had slightly faded over time. She hesitated. Her hand lifted slowly, then paused in the air. For a moment it felt like she was standing between two worlds, the life she had now, and the one she had left behind. Then, without thinking too much, she gently removed the cloth. A thin layer of dust rose into the air. She brushed it off with her hand and sat down on the chair. Her fingers hovered above the keys, unsure, almost afraid. It had been so long. What if she had forgotten everything? What if she couldn't play anymore? The thought made her chest feel tight. But at the same time, there was something else. A quiet voice inside her, telling her to try. Just once. She took a deep breath and slowly pressed a single key. The sound was soft, slightly uneven, but real. She froze. Then she pressed another, and another. The notes didn't form a melody yet, but they were enough to bring back something she thought was gone. Her eyes slowly closed. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about work, responsibilities, or the next day. She was simply there, in that moment, with the sound of the keys under her fingers. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was a beginning. Outside, the city moved on like always, unaware of the quiet moment taking place in that small room. And inside, something long buried had just started to wake up. The next few days felt a little different, though nothing around her had really changed. The restaurant was still busy, the same faces came and went, and the routine stayed exactly as it had always been. But inside her, something had quietly shifted after that night with the old keyboard. She didn't suddenly become confident or bold. She still spoke less than others and kept her head down while working. But there was a small change in the way she moved, almost like she was carrying a secret no one else knew about. Every night after work, she returned to her room and sat in front of the keyboard again. At first, her fingers felt stiff, like they didn't belong there anymore. She would press a few keys, pause, try again, and sometimes stop out of frustration. There were moments when she thought about giving up again. But she didn't. Slowly, very slowly, the sounds began to make more sense. Her fingers started remembering what her mind had forgotten. Simple notes turned into small patterns. Small patterns turned into pieces of melody. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep her going. She didn't tell anyone. At the restaurant, she continued to act the same way as before. Quiet, focused, and invisible. But now, whenever she passed by the piano, she didn't just glance at it. She looked at it with a little more awareness, like it was no longer just something distant. One afternoon, while wiping a nearby table, she noticed the lid of the piano was slightly open. That was unusual. It was usually kept closed unless someone was about to play it. She paused for a second. The room was nearly empty. Only a couple of staff members were in the kitchen, and no customers were around. The soft background music played from the speakers, filling the silence. Her eyes moved toward the piano again. For a brief moment, she thought about walking over and closing the lid. That would have been the normal thing to do, but her feet didn't move. Instead, she stood there, holding the cloth in her hand, her thoughts pulling her in a different direction. Her heart started beating a little faster. No one's watching. A quiet thought passed through her mind, but almost immediately another thought followed. This isn't your place. She shook her head slightly and turned away, continuing to clean as if nothing had happened. But her focus was gone. Her hands moved, but her mind stayed near the piano. That feeling stayed with her for the rest of the day. By evening, the restaurant was once again filled with people. The lights dimmed slightly, creating a warm and elegant atmosphere. Conversations blended together, and the sound of cutlery added to the background noise. It was one of those nights when everything needed to go perfectly. There was a special event planned, and the guests were important. The manager had reminded everyone to be extra careful, to avoid mistakes, and to maintain a high standard of service. She moved quickly between tables, making sure everything was in place. Plates were served on time, drinks were refilled, and every request was handled with care. In the middle of all this, she noticed something unusual. The piano was still empty. Usually, on nights like this, a pianist would already be there, playing soft music in the background. But tonight, the seat remained untouched. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe the performer was running late. But as time passed, the absence became more noticeable. Guests started looking around. Some whispered to each other. A few glanced toward the manager with questioning expressions. The manager himself looked uneasy. He checked his watch, walked toward the entrance, then back again. He pulled out his phone, made a call, and waited. His face tightened slightly. Something wasn't right. A few minutes later, he spoke quietly with another staff member. Their expressions made it clear there was a problem. Word began to spread among the staff. "The pianist isn't coming," someone whispered near the kitchen. "Are you serious?" another replied. "He's not picking up his phone." A small wave of tension moved through the team. The music from the speakers continued, but it wasn't the same. It lacked the warmth and presence of live performance. And in a place like this, details mattered. Guests began to notice more clearly now. One table near the center started speaking louder than usual. "I thought there was supposed to be live music tonight," one guest said, slightly annoyed. Another nodded. "That's what they advertised." The manager heard the comments. He forced a polite smile and approached the table, offering a calm explanation. But even as he spoke, it was clear he didn't have a real solution yet. Back in the service area, the staff exchanged worried looks. "What are we going to do?" someone asked. "No idea," another replied. "We can't just leave it like this." She listened quietly while passing by, carrying a tray of glasses. Her face remained calm, but inside, something was stirring. Her eyes moved toward the piano again. It sat there, silent, almost out of place in the middle of everything. For a brief moment, the thought crossed her mind. "I could," but she stopped herself before the thought could fully form. "No," she told herself quickly. That wasn't her role. That wasn't her place anymore. She tightened her grip on the tray and continued walking. Meanwhile, the situation was getting worse. More guests started noticing. The atmosphere, which was supposed to feel special, began to lose its charm. The soft recorded music couldn't fill the space the same way. The manager walked back and forth, clearly stressed. He spoke to the staff again, asking if anyone had any ideas. But no one responded. There was silence. Then, someone laughed lightly and said, "Maybe one of us should play." It sounded like a joke, and a few people smiled, but no one took it seriously. Except her. She froze for a second where she stood. Her heart started beating louder. The words echoed in her mind. "Maybe one of us should play." She lowered her gaze, trying to focus on her work again. But the thought wouldn't go away. Her hands felt slightly cold. She walked into the kitchen, placed the tray down, and took a deep breath. "This is not for you," she whispered to herself. But another voice inside her spoke just as clearly. "You've been playing again." Her chest felt tight. She stood there for a few seconds, caught between doubt and something she couldn't fully explain. Outside, the voices of the guests continued. The manager's calm tone was starting to sound strained. Time was passing, and the problem wasn't going away. She stepped back out into the main hall. The piano was still there, still silent, still waiting. Her eyes stayed on it longer this time. The noise around her faded slightly, like everything else was becoming less important. She could feel it again, that same pull she had felt in her room, sitting in front of the old keyboard. But this time it was stronger, real, and much harder to ignore. She swallowed slowly. Her feet didn't move yet. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't immediately turn away either. Something was building inside her, quiet but powerful. And deep down, she knew this moment was not like the others. Something was about to change. She just didn't know if she had the courage to let it happen. The noise of the restaurant continued around her, but it felt distant, like it was happening somewhere far away. She stood near the edge of the room, holding a tray she had forgotten to move, her eyes fixed on the piano. It was still empty, still silent, still waiting. The manager walked past her quickly, speaking under his breath, clearly stressed. He stopped near the service counter and spoke to another staff member again, asking if there was any update. There wasn't. The pianist was still unreachable. A few guests were now openly showing their disappointment. One table had gone quiet in an uncomfortable way, while another spoke loudly enough for others to hear. The energy in the room was slowly slipping, and everyone could feel it. She shifted her weight slightly, trying to bring herself back to her work. But her focus was gone. Her mind kept returning to the same thought, again and again. "You can do this." "No, you can't." The two voices inside her felt louder than the entire room. She placed the tray down on a nearby counter and took a slow breath. Her hands felt slightly shaky. She rubbed them together as if trying to steady herself. From across the room, one of the staff members looked at her and said, "Can you take water to table 6? She nodded quickly, grateful for something to do. She picked up a jug and walked toward the table, her steps steady but her thoughts still racing. As she poured water into the glasses, she could feel the eyes of the guests on her. Not because they were paying attention to her, but because everyone was aware that something was missing tonight. The usual calm flow of music wasn't there to soften the silence between conversations. She finished and stepped away, but her eyes moved back to the piano almost without thinking. It was strange. That same object that had once felt distant now felt close, almost like it was calling her. She looked away quickly. "This is not your place," she reminded herself again. But the reminder didn't feel as strong as before. Near the entrance, the manager was now speaking to a guest who looked particularly unhappy. He apologized politely, explaining that there had been an unexpected issue. The guest listened, but it was clear they weren't fully satisfied. The manager nodded, trying to stay calm, but as he turned away, his expression changed. The pressure was showing. He ran a hand through his hair and looked around the room, searching for something, anything, that could fix the situation. For a brief moment, his eyes passed over her. Then he looked away. Of course he did. Why would he think of her? She lowered her gaze, a small part of her feeling relieved, and another part, not so much. She moved back toward the service area, but her steps slowed as she got closer to the piano again. It was right there, closer than it had ever felt before. The polished surface reflected the soft lights above. The keys were partially visible under the slightly open lid. Everything about it looked calm, but there was something powerful in that stillness. She stopped, just for a second. Her heart began to beat faster. She looked around. No one was paying attention to her. Everyone was busy with their own worries, the staff trying to keep things running, the guests waiting for something to change. She took one small step forward, then another. Her breath felt shallow now. "What are you doing?" her mind whispered, but her feet kept moving. She was only a few steps away when a voice behind her broke the moment. "Hey, where are you going?" She turned quickly. One of her coworkers stood there, looking confused. "Nothing. I was just—" She paused, searching for words. "Checking something." The coworker frowned slightly but didn't push further. "We need help in the back." She nodded quickly. "I'm coming." For a moment, she thought the moment had passed. That was it. The chance, if it even was one, had slipped away. She turned and followed her coworker toward the kitchen. Inside, things were just as busy. Orders were being called out, plates were being prepared, and everyone was moving fast. She picked up a stack of dishes and began helping without saying anything. But her mind wasn't there. The image of the piano stayed with her. The silence around it, the empty seat, and that feeling, that pull. After a few minutes, she set the dishes down and stepped aside. Her chest felt tight again, like something inside her was asking to be heard. She closed her eyes for a brief second. "You've already started playing again," that quiet voice reminded her. Her fingers moved slightly, as if remembering the keys. She opened her eyes. The noise of the kitchen came rushing back, but it didn't feel as loud anymore. Without thinking too much, she wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped back out into the main hall. The situation hadn't improved. If anything, the mood had become heavier. The manager was still trying to keep things under control, but it was clear he was running out of options. She stood there, just for a moment. Then something inside her shifted. This time, it wasn't hesitation. It was decision. Her steps were slow, but steady as she walked toward the manager. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she didn't stop. When she reached him, she hesitated for a split second. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but clear. I can try." The manager didn't understand at first. He looked at her, confused. "Try what?" She swallowed, her hands tightening slightly at her sides. "The piano," she said quietly. For a moment he just stared at her. It was as if her words didn't fully register. "You?" he asked, not harshly but with surprise. She nodded, though her confidence felt fragile. I'm not a professional," she added quickly. "But I can play." The manager glanced toward the piano, then back at her. The noise of the room seemed to fade again, at least for her. He looked uncertain. This was not part of the plan. This was not expected. But then again, nothing about this evening was going as planned. He exhaled slowly. "Are you sure?" he asked. She hesitated for just a second. No, she wasn't sure. Not completely. But she nodded anyway. "Yes." The manager looked around the room again. The guests were still there, waiting, watching, expecting something. He didn't have many choices left. After a brief pause, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Go ahead." The words felt both heavy and light at the same time. Her heart started racing. There was no turning back now. She took a step away from him and turned toward the piano. The walk felt longer than it actually was. Each step echoed in her mind. The conversations in the room began to quiet slightly as people noticed her movement. A few guests looked at her with curiosity. Others barely paid attention, assuming it was just another staff task. But some noticed something different. A waitress walking toward the piano? Whispers began to spread quietly. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment. Up close, it felt even more real. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface. For a brief second, doubt returned. What if you fail? Her chest tightened. But then she remembered the small room. The old keyboard. The first note she had played after all those years. She took a slow breath. Her hands moved to the bench and she sat down. The room grew quieter. More people were watching now. Some curious. Some doubtful. Some simply waiting. She placed her hands gently above the keys. They hovered there, just for a moment, slightly trembling. The lights felt brighter. The silence felt heavier. And in that moment, with all eyes slowly turning toward her, she closed her eyes briefly and prepared to play. Her fingers rested lightly above the keys, not pressing anything yet. The room had gone quieter than before, not completely silent, but enough that the small sounds could be heard. The clink of a glass, a chair shifting, a soft whisper somewhere in the back. Most people were now looking in her direction, unsure of what to expect. She could feel it, the attention, the doubt, the curiosity. Her hands trembled slightly, and for a second, she thought about standing up and walking away. No one would stop her. They would probably just assume she had changed her mind. But something inside her refused to let that happen. She took a slow breath, then another. Her eyes lowered to the keys. For a brief moment, everything around her seemed to fade. The guests, the lights, the pressure. None of it felt as strong as the memory rising inside her. She remembered the first time she had ever played. Not in this restaurant. Not in front of people. But in a small, quiet place where she had learned to trust her own hands. That memory gave her just enough courage. Her fingers moved. The first note came out soft. So soft that it almost disappeared into the room. But it was there. Clear. Real. She didn't stop. Another note followed. Then another. The sound was simple at first, almost uncertain, like someone trying to find their way in the dark. A few people shifted in their seats, still unsure of what they were listening to. But she kept going. Her hands began to move more naturally, slowly finding a rhythm. The hesitation in her fingers started to fade. The notes connected with each other, forming something gentle, something calm. The room grew quieter. Conversations that had been continuing in the background slowly faded away. People started paying attention without even realizing it. She still wasn't looking up. Her focus stayed on the keys, her fingers, the sound. Each note felt like a step forward. Each moment felt like she was crossing a distance she had been avoiding for years. Then something changed. The melody grew stronger. Not louder but deeper. More certain. Her hands no longer trembled. They moved with a kind of quiet confidence, like they had finally remembered what they were meant to do. The music began to fill the space in a way the recorded sound never could. It wasn't just background anymore. It was presence. A table near the center stopped talking completely. A woman who had been checking her phone slowly lowered it and looked up. A man who had been speaking mid-sentence paused, his words fading away as he turned his head toward the piano. Even the staff felt it. In the kitchen doorway, one of the workers leaned out slightly, watching with a surprised expression. "Is that her?" someone whispered. No one answered. They were too focused on the sound. She let herself go a little further into the music. Her fingers moved faster now, but still controlled. The melody carried emotion. Something soft at first, then slowly building into something more powerful. It wasn't perfect. There were small imperfections, tiny slips that only someone trained might notice. But no one cared, because what they felt was real. That mattered more. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't performing for approval. She was simply playing. And that honesty reached everyone in the room. The music rose and fell like a quiet wave. At times it felt light, almost hopeful. At other moments, it carried a deeper weight, like it was telling a story without using any words. Somewhere in the room, someone took a deep breath, as if they had forgotten to breathe before. Another person leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on her hands. The manager stood still near the side, watching in disbelief. Just minutes ago, he had been searching for a solution. Now, the answer was right in front of him, and it was something he had never expected. The entire room was changing. The tension that had been building earlier was gone. In its place, there was something else. Stillness. Not empty stillness, but the kind that holds attention, emotion, and quiet understanding. She continued playing, unaware of how much she had already changed the atmosphere. Or maybe she was aware, but she didn't let it distract her. Her eyes stayed down. Her mind stayed with the music. At one point, she allowed herself to look up just for a second. What she saw made her pause inside, even though her hands kept moving. People were watching, not casually, not with doubt, but with something else. Respect, curiosity, and something close to amazement. She quickly lowered her gaze again, her heart beating faster. But this time it wasn't fear. It was something warmer, something stronger. The melody shifted again, becoming softer, almost like it was preparing to come to an end. The notes slowed, each one lasting a little longer than the last. The room remained completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the smallest sounds seemed to disappear. Felt like time itself had slowed down, just to listen. Her fingers moved gently across the final sequence of notes, each one placed carefully, like the closing words of a story. Then, with one last soft touch, the music stopped. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment longer. Then they slowly lifted. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't uncertain. It wasn't awkward. It was full. Full of everything the music had just carried. For a few seconds, no one reacted. It was as if the room needed time to return to itself. She sat still, unsure of what to do next. Her heart was beating loudly again, and for a moment, doubt tried to return. Was it enough? Did they like it? But before those thoughts could grow stronger, someone started clapping. Just one person at first, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. It wasn't polite or forced. It was real, strong, unexpected. People stood up from their seats. Some smiled. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others simply kept clapping, as if they didn't want the moment to end. She froze slightly at the sound, not expecting it to be this strong. Her eyes lifted slowly, taking in the scene. All those people, looking at her, not as a waitress, but as something more. Her hands rested quietly in her lap as she tried to understand what was happening. The same room that had once ignored her was now completely focused on her. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible anymore. The applause didn't stop quickly. It kept going, filling the room with a kind of energy no one had expected when the night began. People who had come for a simple dinner were now standing, clapping, some even smiling at each other as if they had just witnessed something rare. She sat there for a few seconds, unsure how to react. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, and her breathing was still uneven from everything that had just happened. This kind of attention was unfamiliar. Just minutes ago, she had been moving silently between tables. Now all eyes were on her. Felt unreal. Slowly, she stood up from the bench. The applause grew even louder for a moment, as if her standing confirmed that the performance was truly over. She gave a small, unsure nod, not quite knowing how to respond to such a reaction. Her instinct was to leave quickly, to return to the comfort of being unnoticed again. But her feet didn't move right away. She looked around, taking in the faces in front of her. Some people looked surprised. Some looked impressed. And a few looked deeply moved, like the music had reached them in a way they didn't expect. She lowered her gaze slightly, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't fully explain. From the side of the room, the manager began walking toward her. His expression had completely changed from earlier. The stress and worry were gone, replaced by something closer to amazement. When he reached her, he didn't speak immediately. For a second, he just looked at her, as if trying to understand what had just happened. He paused, searching for the right words. I didn't know you could play like that. She shifted slightly, her hands coming together in front of her. I used to, she said quietly. A long time ago. The manager nodded slowly, still processing. You should have told me. She gave a small, almost apologetic smile. It didn't feel important anymore. He looked at her again, more carefully this time, as if seeing her for the first time. Not just as someone who worked there, but as someone with a story he had never noticed. Well, he said after a moment, it is important now. Before she could respond, a guest approached them. It was one of the people sitting near the center, someone who had been watching closely during the performance. The guest smiled politely, but there was something genuine in that expression. That was beautiful, the guest said. I wasn't expecting that at all. She nodded slightly, unsure of what to say. Do you perform somewhere? The guest asked. She shook her head. No, The guests seemed surprised. "You should." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Before she could reply, another guest stepped closer, then another. Within moments, a small group had formed around her. They weren't crowding her, but their attention was clear. Each of them had something to say. "That was amazing. I've never seen anything like that here. You really changed the whole evening." She listened quietly, her responses small and polite. She wasn't used to this kind of interaction. Normally, her conversations were short and focused on orders or service. This was different. This was personal. The manager stood nearby, watching the scene with a thoughtful expression. He had seen many events in this restaurant, many performers, many guests. But this moment felt different, even to him. Eventually, the guests returned to their tables, still talking about what they had just witnessed. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something had clearly changed. The energy was lighter, warmer, more connected. She stepped away from the piano and moved toward the service area, almost automatically returning to her role. She picked up a tray and began working again, but it didn't feel the same. People looked at her now, not in a casual way but with recognition. Some smiled when she passed by. Some nodded. One guest even thanked her again as she placed a plate on the table. It was a strange feeling. Part of her wanted to hide from it, but another part didn't. Later that night, when the restaurant finally began to quiet down, the staff gathered briefly in the back area. It was their usual routine before closing, cleaning, organizing, and preparing for the next day. But tonight, the mood was different. "You didn't tell us you could play like that," one of them said, half joking, half serious. She gave a small shrug. "I didn't think it mattered." "It matters," another replied quickly. "That was not normal. That was something else." A few others nodded in agreement. She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled lightly and continued wiping the counter. One of them leaned slightly closer and said, "Why did you stop?" The question caught her off guard. She paused for a moment. There were many reasons. Too many to explain in a simple answer. "Life," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. The others didn't press further. They understood enough. Everyone has their own story. Everyone has things they leave behind. But sometimes those things don't stay gone forever. When her shift ended, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets were quieter now, the noise of the day replaced by a softer kind of silence. She began walking toward her room, her steps slow, her mind still full of everything that had happened. The night felt different, not because the world had changed, but because something inside her had. When she reached her room, she didn't turn on the light right away. She stood near the doorway for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. Then her eyes moved toward the corner. The old keyboard. It was still there, just as she had left it. But now it didn't look forgotten. It looked like something waiting. She walked over to it slowly and sat down. Her hands rested on the keys, but she didn't play immediately. Instead, she just sat there, thinking about the restaurant, the piano, the people, the applause. It all felt like a dream, but it wasn't. It had happened, and it had changed something she thought was gone forever. She pressed a key softly, then another. The sound filled the small room just like it had before. But this time it felt different, stronger, more certain. She wasn't playing to remember anymore. She was playing because she wanted to, because she could, and because, for the first time in a long while, she believed that maybe this part of her life wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning again. The next morning felt different, even before she opened her eyes. It wasn't loud or dramatic. Nothing outside had changed. The same narrow street, the same early light coming through the window, the same small room. But inside her, something was no longer the same. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the memories from the night before come back slowly. The piano, the silence, the way the room had listened, the sound of people clapping, louder than she had ever imagined. For a second, she wondered if she had dreamed it. But then she turned her head and saw the keyboard in the corner. The cloth was still off. That was enough to remind her. It had all been real. She sat up slowly and placed her feet on the floor. Usually, mornings felt heavy, like she had to push herself to start the day. But today, there was something lighter in her chest. Not excitement exactly, but something close to it. She got ready the same way as always, but her movements felt more aware, more present. Even small things, pouring water, tying her hair, picking up her bag, felt clearer, like she was paying attention in a way she hadn't before. When she stepped outside, the air felt fresh. People were already moving through the streets, heading to work, talking, living their lives. She walked among them, just another person in the crowd. But this time, she didn't feel invisible. Not completely. At the restaurant, things were already in motion. The doors were open, and a few early guests had arrived. Inside, the staff was preparing for the day, setting tables and organizing supplies. As soon as she stepped in, she felt it. The difference. A few heads turned toward her. Not in a strange or uncomfortable way, but in a way that showed recognition. One of her coworkers gave her a small smile. "You're early today," they said. She nodded. "Couldn't sleep much." They smiled again. "I don't blame you." There was no teasing in the tone, just a quiet understanding. She moved toward the back area, placing her bag down and tying her apron. Everything looked the same as it always had, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The manager walked in a few minutes later. When he saw her, he paused for a moment, then walked over. "Good you're here," he said. She straightened slightly, unsure of what he would say next. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he glanced toward the piano, then back at her. "About last night," he began. "I've been thinking." Her hands tightened slightly at her sides, but she stayed quiet. "We have another event coming up this weekend," he continued. "A small one, but still important." She listened carefully. "The pianist we usually call?" He paused, then shook his head lightly. "Let's just say I'm not relying on that again." There was a brief silence between them. Then he looked at her more directly. "Would you be willing to play?" The question felt simple, but the weight behind it was not. Her first instinct was to say no. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure if she could do it again. Last night had been unexpected. There had been no time to think, no time to doubt. She had just stepped forward and played. This was different. This was a choice. She looked toward the piano. It stood there quietly, just like always. But now it didn't feel distant anymore. She took a slow breath. I don't know," she said honestly. The manager nodded, not pushing her. "You don't have to decide right now." She appreciated that. "I just think," he added. "What happened last night wasn't something small. People noticed. I noticed." She lowered her gaze slightly. "You don't have to stay in the background if you don't want to," he said quietly. The words stayed with her. He gave her a small nod and walked away, leaving her standing there with her thoughts. The rest of the day went on as usual, at least on the outside. Orders were taken, food was served, tables were cleared. But inside her, everything felt different. Every time she passed by the piano, she looked at it. Not with hesitation, but with thought. She kept remembering the feeling of sitting there. The way her hands had moved. The way the room had listened. And the way she had felt after. Seen. Later in the afternoon, during a quieter moment, she found herself standing near the piano again. The room was calm, with only a few guests scattered around. She stepped closer. This time, she didn't stop herself. She reached out and gently touched the edge of the piano. The surface was cool under her fingers. Real. She pulled the bench out slightly and sat down. Just for a moment. Her hands rested on her lap. She didn't play. Not yet. She just sat there, letting herself feel the space, the quiet, the possibility. A few seconds passed. Then she stood up again and stepped away. But something had already become clear. That fear she had felt before, it was still there. But it wasn't as strong. That night, back in her room, she sat at the keyboard again. But this time she didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved with more confidence than before. The notes came together more smoothly, forming melodies that felt fuller, more complete. She played longer than she usually did. Not because she was trying to practice, but because she didn't want to stop. At one point, she paused and looked down at her hands. They didn't feel unfamiliar anymore. They felt like her own again. She leaned back slightly, taking a deep breath. Then she smiled. It was small, but real. The next day, when she returned to the restaurant, she didn't wait. She found the manager during a quiet moment. "I'll do it," she said. He looked at her, understanding immediately. "You're sure?" She nodded. "Yes." He smiled, not in surprise this time, but in approval. "Good." The days leading up to the event passed quickly. She continued her work as usual, but now there was something more in her routine. Purpose. She spent her evenings practicing. Not perfectly, not endlessly, but enough to feel ready. Still, she knew something important. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest. The night of the event arrived. The restaurant was filled again, the lights warm, the atmosphere carefully prepared. But this time, the piano was not empty. She stood near it, not as someone filling in at the last moment, but as someone who belonged there. Her heart still beat fast. Her hands still felt slightly nervous. But she didn't step back. When the time came, she sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and began. The first note carried across the room, clear and steady. And this time, she didn't feel like she was stepping into something unknown. She felt like she had finally returned to something that had always been hers. The room listened, the music flowed, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of meaning, not just for the people listening, but for her. Because this time, she wasn't just playing for a moment. She was playing for her life, and she wasn't going to hide it anymore.